Hello, guys and gals, and welcome. So today we're going to be talking about something fun, something that I've wanted to do a video on for a while, and no better time than now because in Season 6 I actually made some pretty cool characters using both of these abilities. And what am I going to be talking about? Well, I'm going to be talking about Conviction versus Lower Resistance. We're going to do an in-depth analysis of Conviction versus Lower Resistance, and we're going to talk about why some are better than the others. And without further ado, let's get started. All right. So when I started season six, I had two particular characters in mind. One of them was a two-handed paladin that used conversion and thorns, and I ended up going with vengeance because it just made sense to have elemental damage instead of physical damage, just in case I was going to accidentally kill myself. Which it's helped, but it's not quite a foolproof plan. Another character that I wanted to make was an elemental necromancer utilizing lower resistance, and I did fire. And I have had a nice, beautiful time playing with both low resistance and conviction. And I have a lot to say between the two and why I think one is better than the other. Put down in the comments right now which one you think is better. And then by the end of this video, you'll find out which one I think is better. And we'll talk about it from there. So I have some data to go over first. We're going to talk about the data first before we get into other things. First off, conviction versus lower resistance. Conviction has a maximum of 150% reduction in resistance. You divide that by 5 versus immunes, which gets you a 30% immune reduction, which is decent. Lower resistance is a lot more difficult to pin down. It does have a relatively high percentage it can go to, but it also requires you to be at like level 60 to get there. So I've chosen level 30. I'm going to write this in here, level 30 as my goalpost, because it really feels like anything higher than level 30 just doesn't quite understandably just attainable without being absolutely ridiculous with plus the skills. I mean, you could even go up to level 40 if you wanted to, but basically there's a severe diminishing returns, and so I just picked level 30 as my goalpost there, especially considering that conviction caps out at level 25, which is very important. So you don't really want the conviction to go past level 25. In fact, most of the time you actually will not put in the full points into conviction because you have the torch, so subtract 3, and then you get the Annie, which subtracts 1. So you end up with a lot less than like your maximum amount. So as long as you're using like any plus the skill equipment past a torch and an Annie, and then you got like, it's like a +2 skill amulet or like a +2 skill helmet or something like that, you're very easily going to reduce the number of total points that you put into conviction relatively easily. Now, basically, these two abilities, between conviction and lower resistance, you can see that lower resistance reduces only by 65%, which is a pretty big difference between conviction's 150. And on top of that, when it's divided by 5, which is the immune penalty, it only goes down to 13%, which is pretty bad considering that conviction offers a 30% reduction to immunes. If you're unfamiliar with the formula of how this works, basically if a monster is immune, so if a monster is immune, conviction and lower resistance suffer a 1/5 penalty to effectiveness. This means that for the most part, the huge number that you see is relatively stunted. And honestly, they're not really that effective. Not really very effective versus immunes. The main thing that they were used for a very long time before Sunder Charms was to break immunity. That was the main purpose that they had. But Sunder Charms kind of just like borked that. And the reason why they borked that was because, well, now the Sunder Charms break the immunity, and you don't necessarily need conviction or lower resistance to break immunity anymore. Um, they still suffer the penalty, even if Sunder Charms have broken the immunity for you. which is important, which means that they have to be judged based on what they provide other than breaking and immunity. Now, the range of conviction is 13.3 yards, and it also has some other quirks. And this is something that you'll notice when you actually use conviction on a native character, or if you put it on a mercenary. Doesn't really matter. There is an activation time, and this quirk is actually kind of nasty. I've played around with a lot of conviction characters. I did a Vengeance Paladin. I've done a two-handed Vengeance Paladin. I've done a Dream Paladin. I've done a self-wielding Infinity Spears on. All sorts of very interesting characters. And one thing that has rung true for the most part, no matter what, is that conviction kind of just does whatever it wants to do. It has almost what seems to be an activation time of, I want to say it's 3 seconds, like total, but it's a rolling 3 seconds. It seems to be like 3 seconds of activation time, and then if it's activated, it stays activated for those 3 seconds. But the problem is that if you miss an activation window, and this is something that's really quite interesting. So if I let the monsters run toward me, you'll notice that some of the monsters have conviction on them, and then some of them don't, because as they're running toward me, they're getting conviction. And then you see that one obtained conviction shortly after this one obtained conviction because he walked into range. And so it really depends on like what time period you have when you enter combat, and it ends up being really silly, but it is actually a negative in my opinion, because this activation time means that a lot of the times when you're fighting monsters, conviction won't be active because it already technically activated before the monster walked into range. I don't really know how else I can paint this other than imagine a scenario where, I don't know, a guy is giving away $1 million to everyone that's inside of the building. And he gives away $1 million to everybody inside the building, but he does this like once every 10 seconds, right? And you walk into the building and he's already given away $1 million, and you don't know this. And you're in the building for all of 8 seconds. You realize you've forgotten your wallet, right? You walk back outside of the building before it hits 10 seconds. He gives away another $1 million, and you have missed both $1 million. You missed the first one because you weren't inside the building when he gave away the first $1 million, and then a full 10 seconds passes, and then you weren't inside the range of the second $1 million that he gave away, so you missed both $1 million. So the activation time of conviction can sometimes be frustrating, depending on where the monster is standing, what's going on, like when did you, come within range of the monster. Because a lot of the times, if you come in range of the monster, like at the very beginning of the activation sequence, and they only just miss the activation sequence, they will stay deactivated for the full time until the next activation sequence. And you can also have a situation where a monster will miss the activation sequence multiple times in a row, which is a pain in the butt, especially when you are relying on the negative defense to allow you to hit monsters. So as you can see, I only have 6,170 attack rating. Well, I don't need much attack rating because I've got this huge negative defense on conviction. But the problem is a lot of the times you'll go into combat and the monster will unfortunately be somewhat immune to your conviction aura for a couple seconds, which basically means you just kind of whiff, 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 whiff until the activation period arises again. And this is definitely a downside for conviction. Meanwhile, the range of lower resistance is basically like 24 plus yards, depending on the level of your ability. And it also has a relatively long duration as well, which means that in terms of stick-to-itiveness, I'll say stick-to-itiveness because that's an interesting way to put it. Stick-to-itiveness, you're pretty much giving the win to lower resistance. And what do I mean by this? Well, because lower resistance has a range of 24 plus yards, mine is currently 24.6 yards. And it has a duration of 80 seconds. 80 seconds is a really long time in combat. This means that not only does lower resistance stay active more often, but it also stays active when you're not present, which is another big downside to conviction. So if we put that on like a little scoreboard and we say, okay, well, conviction has some problems, right? This is a mark against it. Well, that is definitely a mark against it. Conviction is only active if you are present. If it's on a mercenary, it's only active if your mercenary is present. It also is only active if they actually are inside the range during the activation pulse. It's probably the best way to describe it, activation pulse. And of course, they have to stay within range to continually receive this activation pulse. Lower resistance, on the other hand, is something that you can literally just walk up, cast, and walk away. It has such a large range that it will literally hit everything on the screen to a ridiculous degree. And of course, I need to cast my little fire golem here. But it will literally hit everything to a ridiculous degree. The kind of ridiculous degree which is insane. And not only can you hit everything on the screen that can possibly be hit, but you can do so in a much larger than 24-yard radius. And you might be wondering what I'm talking about. Well, think about it like this. Okay, if I cast lower resistance in the center of the screen, notice how it covers literally the entire screen? That lower resistance is literally covering all of the screen, right? Well, why would you cast it in the center of the screen, though? At 24-yard radius, then yes, it's already a larger radius than Conviction, hits more monsters, stays active more often, and basically is more useful in general because of its activation status, right? But the thing about this is that it's a curse that you can cast anywhere, not just on your center. You can cast it at the edges of the screen. So if I want to curse an entire screen full of monsters and multiple screens on either side, I would go corner, 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 corner. And this means that I am going to curse literally everything within range for many screens around me. Which means that we can't even necessarily say that Conviction only has, or sorry, lower resistance only has a 24-yard radius. We have to say that lower resistance has a 24-yard plus radius times 4. Because technically, you can apply that 24-yard radius at the corners of the screen, and then on top of that, we also have to include the initial screen, which is also being coded by lower resistance in this regard, which means we're looking at more like 24 times 5 in terms of the size that you can potentially utilize this. Now, why is this so much better than the way that Conviction does things? Well, if you look at a place like the cow level. Of course, I don't have a leg just sitting on me, but we could probably just go snag one real quick. It shouldn't be too difficult. But if you go to the cow level and you grab yourself a lower resistance necromancer and you bring him in there with you, one of the things that you're going to notice pretty much right off the bat is how ridiculously powerful lower resistance curse is when you're dealing with really large packs of monsters. Now, of course, this guy, I don't have his army set up, which it's probably going to be a death sentence for me. But I feel like there's no better place to show this off than the cow level. So let's go into the cow level and let's show this off, shall we? Now, if I cast my curse in the cow level, and I cast all over the place, so I can teleport around. I can cast my lower resistance curse all over the place. With an 80-second time, I can literally have pretty much the entire cow level cursed, which means that if you're teamed up with, say, a Javazon, as an example, you can literally just pre-curse most of the monsters before the Javazon ever touches them. With Conviction, on the other hand, because it has such a small radius of 13.3 yards, and it also requires your presence directly within the cow pack, essentially, it's much more difficult to get massive effectiveness out of the, specifically, Conviction aura when you're dealing with very large packs of monsters, right? And as you can see, I can curse pretty much anything. I don't even have to be nearby anymore, because once I apply the curse, it stays active for a pretty long period of time. And this means that anybody can take advantage of that. Doesn't matter whether I'm there or not, which I think is probably one of the coolest things, is that it doesn't really matter whether I'm present. So this is something that we have to put as a negative for conviction as well, is that it requires your presence. I probably messed that up. It requires you to be there. An old trick for misspelling words if you guys are in school or if you are still in college or something like that. And spelling is a consideration when you're writing your papers or your tests or whatever, right? A very simple trick that you can use is if you don't know how to spell a word, or if you feel like you don't know how to spell a word, replace it with another word that you do know how to spell. There's plenty of words that you can use besides the one that you don't know how to spell. So, yeah. And this isn't even the right word. It's there you go. There. Oh, wait. No, there. Yeah, it requires you to be there. All right, so this is kind of a big negative, or rather a big positive for lore resistance, is that you don't have to be there. Okay, so this is really big, and I think this is one of the things that really has sold me on lore resistance versus conviction. Is just the fact that you really can just kind of get the best of it without having to be directly within range of the monster. And not only that, but it hits pretty much the entire screen and for a very long period of time. It's pretty amazing. Now, when you come down to what it does to the monster in terms of immune monsters, conviction definitely wins. So if you're running a 150% conviction paladin, you get 30% reduction to immunes and a 13% reduction for lower resistance to immunes, which is a clear win for conviction in terms of the reduction to an immune monster. And if you're running Asunder, obviously, that's a pretty big boon as well. Now, the problem with this comes into play is that, well, again, it actually has to be active on the monster. If you're a ranged character, especially like sorceresses, various characters that might not necessarily want to be within melee range, 13.3 yards is kind of small, and you might have trouble getting that to actually activate on the target as quickly as you would like. It really kind of just depends on what you're doing and what you have. Now, most characters that are not paladins and most characters that are not necromancers are not going to have access to these two versions, which is also kind of an important thing. So, thinking from that perspective, and you look at the Infinity versus Plague scenario. Now, Infinity has 85% reduction in resistances with a 17% versus immunes. Lower resistance, on the other hand, coming from the Plague Sword, has a 57% reduction in resistances with an 11.4% reduction for immunes, which is actually really interesting when you look at it this way, because you see that Infinity and Plague actually give you about the same amount of damage reduction, or sorry, damage increase or resistance decrease, or however you want to state it, versus immunes, even though they're a little bit further away in terms of their damage versus non-immunes. And I think one of the things that you really have to take into account here is that in most situations, you're not going to have an issue killing monsters that are not immune to you. And this is something that you really have to like repeat to yourself like a mantra. You have to say to yourself over and over again, I don't have any problem killing non-immunes. And this is something that really comes into play when you're considering the difference between conviction and lower resistance, is that yes, conviction and lower resistance both have a massive difference in their power versus non-immunes. But you don't really have any issues killing non-immunes. It's like going into I don't know, let's pretend you went into a house that was filled with cockroaches. And inside this house filled with cockroaches, there was, something mediocre at best, like alongside the cockroaches. Let's say ants. Ants are relatively harmless. They're pretty easy to get rid of. You don't necessarily have too much trouble with ants. You can put some taro out, whatever, and you can definitely get rid of ants relatively quickly. It only takes a couple weeks. Getting rid of cockroaches, on the other hand, is a hell of a lot more difficult, right? Well, if you focus on this number, you're focusing on the number that's helping you with the thing that you're not having any trouble with at all. When the reality of the situation is that the immunes represent the cockroaches. These are the cockroaches. And the cockroaches are definitely the monsters that you're having trouble getting rid of, that you're having trouble, like actually fighting on a regular basis. These are the ones that are going to pose you a problem whenever you get into a serious fight, right? And these cockroaches, you have to consider the methods of killing them. And so when you're looking at the difference between conviction and lower resistance, this really isn't the number you should be focusing on. I mean, this is nice and all. I mean, it'll help you increase your damage versus the monsters that you didn't have any problem killing in the first place. But this is the number that's actually going to help you kill those immunes, those fire immunes, those cold immunes, those lightning immunes, and also in the case of low resistance, those poison immunes. And that's something that you have to take into consideration as well, is that lower resistance is the only one that affects poison. Conviction does not. So in any situation where you're dishing out poison damage and you'd like to enhance that poison damage, lower resistance is going to be superior. Um, So as you can see, when you're looking at Infinity versus Plague, 17% immunes versus immunes and 11.4% immunes, there's relatively zero difference between these two versus immunes because they don't work very well versus immune monsters. So Infinity and Plague don't really help you versus immunes pretty much at all, which means they both kind of suck. And they both kind of suck for this as well, unless you're like a native use paladin running the full version of Conviction. Which leads me to another thing that we have to talk about, which is negative resistance is far more powerful than conviction or lower resistance. So when you're trying to kill immune monsters, when you're trying to get your character set up in a way that they can actually dish out the damage that they would need to kill a monster that is, say, immune to fire, immune to lightning, or immune to cold, negative resistance is a far more powerful modifier because it applies flat and it doesn't have any penalty, which means that if you think about it from this perspective, 17% from an Infinity is barely more than like the 15% that you would get from a Flickering Flame, or the 19. It's not even more than the 19% I'm getting from Mang Songs. Like for instance, if you're using a Phoenix or you're using a Hand of Justice or an Ice or basically 100 other negative resistance items like Crescent Moon at negative 35% and Doom at like negative 60 and stuff like that. You can see that Infinity and Plague don't really compare at all to negative resistance. And negative resistance is far more powerful than conviction or infinity in most situations. It's nice to have conviction. It's nice to have infinity. It enhances your damage to kill those monsters that you don't really have any problem killing anyway. But versus the immunes, conviction and lower resistance actually don't help out all that much. They're tiny in the grand scheme of things. So when you're thinking about the difference between these two, and like a lot of people might actually have this in their mind, they might be like, well, conviction is way better than infinity, or than lower resistance. It's way better than, infinity is way better than plague. But the moral of the story actually is that plague is just about the same as infinity. There's not much difference between them unless you're self-wielding the infinity. If you're self-wielding the infinity, now that's a different story, because self-wielding the infinity means that you're going to have access to the massive negative resistance that is on the infinity itself. And this is something that you also have to realize, is that infinity, when self-wielded, becomes one of the most powerful items in the game because it has negative resistance and conviction, not just conviction. Whereas Plague, on the other hand, which I do have a Plague sitting around here somewhere, I'm pretty sure. I'm like 9,000% sure there's a Plague in here. Somewhere with a Plague window. I'm pretty sure on this guy there's a sword that I've dreamed of once in a Plague-a-bye. Plague-a-bye. That almost sounds like I said Dagobah system. Uh, let's see. Where's my Plague sword? My Plague sword. My Plague sword. My Plague sword. My Plague sword. There's a Plague sword. There's a Plague sword. So when you compare the two of these together, they definitely have some interesting parallels to each other. First of all, obviously, Infinity requires that you stand within that 13.3 yard radius, and they both give you essentially a level 12 of both of the abilities. Versus Immunes, they're essentially the same, which is pretty interesting. Infinity actually makes a surprisingly good melee weapon for a mercenary, and it makes a surprisingly good melee weapon for a Spearzon. Unfortunately, if you put it on a sorceress, it's a little more than a buff stick to give you conviction and negative resistance. Plague, on the other hand, has a massive additional bonus with the cleansing aura, which I freaking really like the cleansing aura that comes from Plague. And on top of that, if we really compare Plague and Infinity together, one of the things that you really have to think about is that, well, Plague is so much cheaper. A Cham rune? That's like the Cham That's basically the entire cost of a Plague Sword, and you have yourself a 20% chance to cast level 12 low resistance Windstruck. Whereas Infinity is Bur Mal Bur Ist. For relatively a lot of extra expense, you're getting, as we see on this chart, you're getting relatively no increase. I mean, it's like, what is that, 6% or less than 6%? So it's like 5.6% additional immune resistance reduction, and it probably rounds down from point 0.4. So we could probably say just 6, but but it's not really a huge additional bonus for the massive increase in cost. On top of this, the Plague Sword, when used on the Barb Merc, if you're going that direction, or if you're using it on yourself, but if you're using it on the Barb Merc, you can put another sword with the Plague Sword, and you can get additional effectiveness out of it. Perhaps you tie it together with a Voice of Reason. Voice of Reason is a very interesting one to give yourself crowd control effects. Perhaps you tie it up with a Grief, or maybe even a Last Wish for Might Aura and things like that. Plague Sword does offer more flexibility when used with the dual-wield Barbarian, which basically means that I think honestly, in my eyes, I think Plague might actually be better than Infinity these days. It offers just better all-around effects. But comparing specifically the lower resist aura and the conviction aura on Infinity and Plague. So if you look at Infinity versus Plague, well, Infinity has a range of 13.3 yards, and the cast range on Plague is 11 and 1/3 yards. Now, the interesting thing about Plague that a lot of people may not know, and it does actually need to be discussed or shown, is that Plague actually doesn't. What's the term? Plague actually doesn't cast on you. It casts on the monster that you are being hit by. I just realized I was like super bright. Of course, I am a redhead with white skin, so it's not surprising I would be blinding everybody. Let me see if I could show you this by actually. I want to take an actual character out and play with it. Let's take the Storm Howl Barbarian. I bet you he can probably do it. He's pretty tanky. So one of the things about the Plague Sword, which is really quite interesting, is that the Plague Sword will cast its effect on the monster who attacks you at a range. Good lord, the sun just came out and turned myself even brighter white. Man, I am shining with the sunlight. You know what? I'm leaving it in. Because I am a golden god, yes. Anyway, so as you can see here, you see how I have this monster right here who is attacking me. I'm going to see if I can, of course, he immediately just one-shots this boy. Let me take his infinity off of him for the moment, because he's being a jerk face. The goal of this is to show you how it casts on monsters that are far away from you. So you'll notice, you see how it's centered on the monster that hit me over here? And this happens all the time. So whenever a monster hits you with a ranged attack, whatever it may be, the plague is actually going to cast the effect on the monster, not on you. And since it's centered on the monster, it actually does a lot better than you would expect. So when we say that it's 11 and 1/3 yards, we have to also annotate to say on the monster that hit you. Now, if you're dealing with melee monsters, then obviously it's going to be basically centered on you, because the melee monster is going to be smacking you in the face, and he's going to be right next to you, so it's going to be basically centered directly on you. However, when a ranged monster or a spellcaster hits you, it's going to be centered on the spellcaster or the ranged monster, and so it's going to be at different places throughout the battlefield, which means that although it might not necessarily seem like lower resistance has a larger range than conviction, it actually does have a much larger range than conviction. And it really just comes down to the fact of where it's going to cast the ability, depending on where the monster is. And this even works for spells. And this is something that I think I can show you guys. Let me see if I can cast up my abilities here real quick so I don't die immediately. And let's go into our wolf form so that we actually have some HP. I'm hoping we get some gloomy bloomies. No, that's explodey boys. Nope, snakes. Okay. A lot of people don't actually know that chance to cast abilities or chance to cast when struck abilities actually do work when you are utilizing a spell. And of course, I guess this works too, because of course these guys are casting spells. But it works on a lot of different spells, not just fire. It also works on lightning. It works on fireballs. It works on cold attacks. There are a lot of things in the game that are considered to be spells that also trigger these effects. As you can clearly see, I'm casting the lower resistance curse many times. So plague swords are actually surprisingly more effective at keeping the curse up on a regular basis, which is actually really nice, which is a pretty good point in plague's favor. It's cheaper. It stays up more often. It hits more monsters on the screen. Obviously, it doesn't require your presence, which is actually really nice. And just in general, whenever I've been playing around with the differences between the two, I do feel like Plague is the clear winner in most regards, but just simply because it is more versatile. You can pair it up with other weapons relatively easily. It is up more often on more monsters across the entire screen. So if you have AoE attacks that you're dishing out massive amounts of damage to everything nearby, there's a much likelier chance that your low resistance curse is actually going to be active on everything. Another very important thing with Plague is that you also get the beautiful cleansing aura and all the other things, which honestly just is a really big boon to it. Now, Infinity does give you the negative defense, which is nice if you need the negative defense. And like I said, if you're wielding it, you get the negative enemy lightning resistance. And if you're self-wielding Infinity, it's obviously going to be better than Plague. But then the funny thing about that is if you're self-wielding Infinity, at that point you could have Plague on your mercenary and you could have your cake and eat it too, which is certainly not terrible either. Some other things that we have to take into account is lower resistance curse overwrites other curses, which can be a detriment in certain situations where life tap or another curse might be required. So for instance, in Ubers where you're relying on life tap to work, lower resistance curse might not necessarily be a good thing and could get you into trouble for overwriting, obviously, the life tap curse, which could get people killed. Obviously, Conviction has the negative defense, which I just talked about earlier, but it is a pretty big boon if you are a melee or range character. I do find it annoying waiting on the activation time, which is a little nasty. If you're actually natively using conviction, you can cancel out other people's conviction, which is a pretty big boon. But you actually have to be natively using the conviction. It doesn't work if you have infinity on your mercenary, or if you have, uh, it's not useful unless you're actively using it. But another problem with this, and this is actually something that is a negative for conviction again, and this is something I found when I built my vengeance paladin, is that the convictions conviction auras cancel each other out based on level. So let's say you're sitting at level 25 and you come across a monster like Uber Mephisto, which has a level 20 conviction aura. Then that is going to subtract 20 from yours, which is going to give you a total of level 5 conviction left over. This means that your conviction is now basically crap. You also have relatively low negative enemy defense, and negative enemy defense is half effective versus bosses anyway. So good luck hitting Uber Mephisto with your canceled out conviction aura. And this is a kind of like a nasty side effect of canceling out conviction auras. Yes, it does prevent you from actually being hit by the conviction aura, which is nice, and prevents that negative resistance, prevents that negative defense. But at the same time, it also cancels out a large portion of your conviction aura, basically making your conviction aura relatively useless. And if you were relying on that negative defense to actually get the damage out to the monster that you're fighting, it doesn't really help out all that much, which kind of sucks. I think that pretty much covers everything. So which one do I think is better? Well, I think lower resistance is better, honestly. I think lower resistance is more effective than most of the other curses in the game. Amplify damage is very nice. Don't get me wrong, and Decrepify is okay, but most characters in the game are dishing out elemental damage because elemental damage is just far superior to physical damage in most ways. It hits all the time. Most monsters aren't immune to physical damage, or sorry, aren't immune to elemental damage as much as they are immune to physical damage. There's a lot more ways to reduce elemental resistance than there is to reduce physical resistance. You can get a monster down easily to negative 200% of an element if you really try, but there's pretty much no way to get an immune monster down to negative 200%. It's not possible. The most that you could ever possibly achieve with amplified damage is 100 divided by 5, which would give you negative 20, plus the Sunder, which would bring them down to 95%, so 95 minus 20, which would bring them down to a massive 75% physical damage reduction. So you're still obviously going to be dishing out relatively no damage in most situations with physical damage. So elemental damage reduction tends to be the better option. And between conviction and lower resistance, it really does seem like lower resistance has quite a few edges over conviction. Um, and if we were to list them out like in a in a line, I mean, it lasts longer. It doesn't require your presence. It hits the entire screen and then some, and 5 screens away, so it can literally be active on more monsters than it should ever be active on. It still provides a reduction for immune monsters, but just not as much. It can still break the resistance of immune monsters, but not as easily as Conviction does. But the interesting thing about this is that most monsters that can't be broken won't be broken by this either. So there's really not much you can do about it. Um, when it comes to Infinity versus Plague, they're pretty much the same versus the cockroaches. And honestly, Plague just has a lot more versatility. It's cheaper. It has the cleansing aura. It has freaking open wounds. It's got tons of various things on it that make it extremely useful. And I think the only negative on it is that it has freezes target, which might not necessarily be a option that Horker Barbs would want. But Horker Barbs don't generally use Infinity or Plague. So, I don't know. It doesn't really matter, does it? Um, What else is left? I mean, I have to conclusively say though, through my playtime on my various characters, through my playtime on my big honkin' axe paladin, GGM trader, uh, tons of time on my fire necromancer, playing in groups throughout season 6, and I did a lot of group play. You can go back and check out my live streams on that. I really do feel like lower resistance is just the better curse all around. More often than not, lower resistance was more useful in groups. It was more useful as a whole when I was leveling up. It was more useful when I was EXPing. More often than not, you don't have physical damage fighters in your group. And even the physical damage fighters that are in your group, a lot of the times are utilizing elemental damage, like Holy Fire Paladins and Holy Shock Paladins. God, the sun is just blazing me. Oh, God. Why? I'm going to turn off my lights. It still didn't do anything. The sun is just, oh, God. But what was I saying? I can't see anymore. The difference between the two was pretty stark. I found that when I was playing my paladin, unless I was present on the battlefield, I wasn't very useful. But with the necromancer, I could curse entire packs of monsters and I could leave, and I was still extremely useful. With the paladin, when I went to the cow level, for instance, and places like that. I got this is terrible. I got to do something about this freaking blinding sunlight here. And of course, it just went away as soon as I went to adjust it. Evil, 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 evil. That's what I get for recording during the daytime. Um, losing my train of thought here. In general, when it came to the Paladin's aura was so much smaller, and it also required my presence. When I was in the cow level, for instance, I would often find myself in dire straits because, well, I couldn't get within range of the cows without, killing myself. This is when I was leveling up, so not the best gear yet. But I would end up dying just trying to apply the conviction to the monsters. Whereas on my Necromancer, I could just curse the entire screen and 5 screens across from all different sides and absolutely just laugh at pretty much any of the stuff that was going on. In general, I do think that lower resistance on the Necromancer is superior to Conviction on the Paladin. I think that Plague is superior to Infinity these days as well, especially given the massive amount of just customizability you have through the Act 5 dual wield mercenary, because of course you can put any other item or weapon in the other slots to get even more benefits. You can even double up plagues if you wanted to, so you can have two chances. But and obviously being much cheaper is also a very big consideration as well. And even if you take it even further than that, you basically can say that not only is Plague cheaper, it's active more often, it's more useful in general, and so is lower resistance. Now, of course, in any given situation, it would be nice if you had both. I mean, having both is certainly not bad. But it definitely seems to me that lower resistance is the superior version of both of them. And the real takeaway that a lot of you can surmise from this, which is actually pretty neat, is that neither one is very good anymore. Conviction and lower resistance are both relatively poor when it comes to breaking and killing immunes. And having negative resistance is far more powerful than having conviction or lower resistance. So in any situation, you should focus on getting negative enemy resistance first and then decide whether you want plague or conviction, unless your character is built on those things. Anyway, as always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watch my videos, even when we're just ranting about the differences between Infinity and Plague or Conviction and Low Resistance. And as always, keep watching.